Hello, my name is Pádraig Ó Tuama, and I am delighted to be with Don McKay, who has been awarded the 2024 Lifetime Achievement Award from Griffin Poetry Prizes. Don, congratulations on your success and this Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's been a great honor and a privilege to be so connected.
Hmm.
Yeah.
I wonder if I could start with you as a teenager. I saw an interview where you described yourself as a teenager as a pseudo jock, which made me surprised that you went on then to study English.
Well, emphasis on the pseudo part of that, Patrick. I was when I grew up it's an industrial town in in Ontario called Cornwall, and I realized when I went to high school I was going to have some kind of sport or another in order
Hmm.
to survive. And so I practiced basketball at a hoop in my backyard obsessively, obsessively.
Hmm.
So the consequence of this is that I I still have I still have the best 3-point shot of any Canadian poet born before 1943. So that's
Congratulations.
that's a kind of thank
That,
you, thank you.
that can be
Actually,
next year's award.
I'm not. I wonder if there's any somewhere in the deep recesses the whole poetry viz. There's a award for poetry, sporting poets, etc. I'm not.
Wow,
Anyway, that's
that can be,
that's
somebody
that's the
could consider
remnants.
that.
That's
Yeah.
the remnants of my athletic career. So yeah.
So the pseudo, did that mean that you were reading poetry and spending a lot of time in books, but felt the need to hide that?
Books for sure. Yeah. And it was kind of like I didn't want to admit it. That's right.
Hmm.
You looked at the people who were getting picked
Yeah.
on, so on, and they were
Hmm.
all sort of brains and intellectuals and so on. So I was kind of uh, developing a disguise, really.
Hmm. Yeah.
And I loved
Hmm.
actually when I got there, I did play basketball, and I loved the
Yeah.
sport. It was great. I still
Yeah.
do. Yeah.
Hmm.
Most I like more not the NBA so much, but more like at the lower levels where you're
Hmm.
actually watching mortals play rather than, you know, people with some kind of, they're all giants to start with.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who did you see reading in your life when you were young?
When I was very young, yeah,
Hmm.
like reading in public, I was
Hmm.
I probably
Or
went.
even somebody at home or anybody, I don't know,
Poetry was not
were
a
there
big.
readers?
Yeah, I don't. I came across poetry mostly when I got to university, you know,
Hmm.
and then um, this was in the 50s. So I was at the advent of the reading becoming popular, at least in North America.
Hmm.
That was before that. So I mostly read poetry I mostly wrote poetry as a, private enterprise.
Hmm.
And when the people actually started reading poetry in public, I thought, oh my word, what is this? And it was hugely stressful. And
Hmm.
now I kind of actually enjoy it, But at that point,
Hmm. Yeah.
it was, uh, and I think that whole thing, this is like the area of Dylan Thomas coming to America, of the
Hmm.
beat poets, reading with jazz in the background and our jazz accompaniment, that kind of thing. There was a huge surge of that in the 50s, and in that continued in the 60s. And I think that probably safe to say that it affected the way people were writing, with way more, with a sense of the oral dimension
Hmm.
in hand rather than just writing for the page. That
Yeah.
your audience was not some other introvert somewhere in the world poem with your poem crouched in a corner reading it, or in a corner of the library where nobody else went reading a poem, but it might actually be somebody, a member of an audience. And it probably
Hmm.
did affect, not consciously, I don't think, but I guess, when you're pushing on this, I'd say, why would a person do a degree on Dylan Thomas if he wasn't interested in the moral dimension of poetry anyway, whether you want to admit it or not?
Yeah.
I did that. So
Yeah, you did. Yeah.
that was quite fascinating to me. And I think, it's writing in a way more operatically floral, poetic way than I would ever attempt to. I was more like based in a kind of colloquial speech, but it it had a valuing of that, which probably somebody who is a Welsh writer or an Irish writer would have more sense of just from the ordinary language, from what's happening in public, than a Canadian would. Canadians are embarrassed to be talking at all. And then to be talking in a way as if you were enjoying it, that's very uncommon. Where I live now in Newfoundland, it's not. Right, Lynette? It's not like, if you're talking, with Newfoundland accent is kind of can be defined as somebody who is speaking and is actually enjoying the act of speaking or admitting to enjoying the act of speaking. And that would not be the case for people growing up in Southern Ontario as I did. So, yeah.
I was going to ask you about place. I mean, I know you were born in Ontario and you've spent time on Vancouver Island and in Wales as well, as you mentioned, New Brunswick, and since 2007 in Newfoundland. How has moving around Canada and overseas as well, how has that influenced your own writing and your own language?
Well, partly because I'm a nature poet. So living in BC, you have a wholly different ecosystem there, west of the Rockies and mountainous. And that was hugely important for me because I became very, very interested in connecting with that ecosystem and not in a touristic way. So when I lived in BC, I spent a lot of that time following a fault line, which is a major fault. It's called the Lost Creek Leech River Fault in BC. And it's kind of inaccessible because it's in Western Forest Products country, so you can't get in there. You can't get in there except on the weekends or after 5 o'clock, or else you sneak in. So it was a nice challenge. So I could follow this fault. It's like the last bit to be added to North America 45 million years ago as the Pacific Plate is varying. So I took up that as a project, Patrick, and I said, I'm going to learn everything about this by walking it. And then when I don't know something, I go learn. It took me a lot of time, spent a lot of time learning. So I had to learn about geology, what's a fault to start with, and how does this one have to be here, and so on. And that's inspired a lot of the poems that we grew out of that in Strike Slip, that's in our volume, and other volumes too. I've not let go of this. And then when I moved from BC to here in Newfoundland is like opera for geologists. It's like fantastic, partly because thanks to the glaciers, which the ice age, which has scraped all the topsoil off and deposited in the ocean as the Grand Banks. So the rock here is extremely visible, extremely eloquent, and so you have way more access to that temporal, that deep time than other places. And at the same time, immensely important fossil discoveries happen right here. Western Stone Throw, where I'm talking from right now, the Ediacaran fossils, which revise our whole idea of what early life was like. It's pre-Cambrian. So I know once I get started into rocks, you have to shut me up. So go ahead. Shut me up.
I mean, I'm actually going to do the dangerous thing, which is to keep you on the same topic, but ask you the question about metaphor. I mean, obviously, rocks and geology are not metaphor; they are themselves. But for you in writing, what are some of the layers of metaphor in looking at geology?
Well, that is interesting you point that out because Stephen Jay Gould, who was a early paleontologist and one who was popularized geology. He was, doing these things on the Burgess Shale out on the West Coast, etc. He says in his book, I think it's called Time Cycle Times Arrow, he says that when you're trying to contemplate deep time, you can't just do it mathematically. Just to have this, if you say that's 2,000 years ago, and then you say, oh no, I meant 20,000 years. Yeah. Well, so that's it. 20. I went 20 million. Oh, no, 200 million. Now, all those things are the same space in my head. They're all just lots and lots of times. It's just that, but he says you have to do it metaphorically. You have to do it metaphorically. And I thought, coming from a geologist, that was a real strong inducement to be a poet of geological process, and plus of that, I've just found myself gripped by it. You're into As a nature poet, you're actually adding this spatial development to this huge temporal develop aspect. And what Stephen Jay Gould says is very humbling, because we realize that not only are we recent inhabitants of the planet, but we have a hard time even contemplating that, So it's a place where language obviously fails. And I think that that failure is a very important linguistic element. I think that's very important for ecological awareness, to realize that reduction to language is not the point. That language has to go kind of beyond itself, and that's where metaphor comes in. Wow, and other poetic processes, obviously.
Sure.
But I think that I was because I was having a hard time sort of thinking, what's the difference between 20,000 years ago, 200,000 years ago, and and then you get to 500 million years ago, which some of the rocks around here, the fossils around here, 500 million, that's 500 million years ago. Holy Moses. So I was having a hard time just contemplating that myself. And when Stephen Jay Gould said that, I thought, okay, it's not just me, it's the species.
It gave permission, and it gave a place for the arts as well and the imagination.
Exactly.
You have a sequence in your most recent book, Lurch, called Problems in Translation. And it is in translation from other human languages. You're talking about translating a river or lichens or a dragon or the microwave background. It seems to me that one of the things that you're picking up is the idea of what does it mean to translate time into something of art, and translate rock as well, and our relationship with it.
Yes, exactly. And partially, I think one of the dangers with scientific language, which of course is important, but one of the dangers is that we translate it to language, and then the language, once we do that, it's like the colonial impulse. Once we do that, we think we own it, or we don't think we own it. We just sort of assume we own it. I can say something like Ediacaran period, say, oh yeah, that's and the translation business reminds us that it all is translation. It all is translation, and that these phenomena have vibrant, astonishing reality in and of themselves, which language is trying to reach through these poetic means,
Sure.
And the fact that
there's knowledge, and then the limitations of knowledge throughout your work. And it seems to me that you have become more fluent in speaking about the limitations of knowledge as the collections of poetry have gone by.
Oh, that would be very heartening to hear. Because I think that's the idea of knowledge as possession. I think it's one of our besetting perils of where we find ourselves at ecologically and in terms of the environment. And I think it's part of a whole wider problem of the instinct to possess. It's either an instinct or it's been so bred into us that it's become kind of second nature for people in Western cultures. And that's one of the lessons that we get maybe from indigenous peoples, I believe I'm right in saying it was Sitting Bull that who said of us, of white people, their desire to possess things is a disease amongst them. And I thought that's partly embedded in our attitudes to language. I go to university and acquire a degree, and I own that. And I can own it, and I can turn it into money, which can get more possession, and so on. Yeah, there's
I've even heard people be described with an ontology to say that she is a PhD. So to say that she or he or they have become the very thing that they have studied. Again,
and like a lot of things,
a way within which that.
Yeah, that habit of speech is kind of indicative, isn't it? Those sorts of habits of speech, like Valentine's Day, I'm yours, be mine. love
Yeah.
being reduced to possession, and we can say,
Yeah.
well, that's not the sense of it, but it's still there, and it's sort of the implications of our habits of speech. Yeah, yeah.
There are
There's a
so many questions throughout your work, John. In the most recent book, in a poem called Mother Carey's Chickens, you echo the old phenomenological question, which is, why is there not nothing? Um, have you
Yes.
come up with any ways of living with that contrast and that unanswerable question?
I was for a while in the middle of trying to write a long essay with that as the that is the title, and try to
Mm.
go back, well, in a very superficial, go back to how many philosophers have asked that question. I think both
Yeah.
Parmenides and Heraclitus both asked that question. Wittgenstein asked it.
Okay. Yeah.
Leibniz asked it. And these are very different philosophers. They come up to this, why is there something rather than nothing? And and it is the question of of wonder itself. It means that we should be
Mm.
just amazed at all aspects of the planet and not just at spectacular things, And
Yeah.
and our amazement should let us become members rather than masters of that
Mm.
environment. That's
Mhm.
that's my that's my kind of ethical slash moral imperative at the moment.
Yeah.
I tried writing this. I was not happy with my writing at all. It's like in this essay,
Mm.
but since you mention it,
Mm.
you're probably prodding me to go back to it, come at it from another direction.
Mm.
You know, probably less
Yeah.
philosophy.
Two of the huge concerns of your work are geology, which we've been speaking about, and birds. And
Yeah,
like, I'm struck by the enormity of geology, and as you mentioned, things like 500 million years. And then the relative fleeting nature of birds, both in terms of their lifespan, which is shorter than ours usually, but
yeah.
also the way within which you can't spend too much time looking at a bird in the wild before it moves away. Um,
Yes.
could you talk a little bit about the way within which that experience of paying attention to birds happened for you? Because you speak about it as something like a conversion almost.
Well, early on, it was that I don't, that wouldn't be too much of an exaggeration, you know. I mean,
Only
a
a bit
friend
of an
teaches me
exaggeration.
when I get into geology, a friend says, "You just get into geology because the rocks don't move around like the birds." It's like if you're going to go see a particular rock formation, it's going to be there. But if I'm going to go to see the habitat, say, well, whooping cranes come
Yeah.
through this area of the prairie, so I'll just go there and hope. You might be disappointed. You might see lots of other things.
Yeah.
You might not see the whooping cranes. It's quite rare. So there was that aspect to it. But yes, I think the birds. I was lived there uh, when I got into birds. I was teaching in London, Ontario, Western University, and um, near there's a place called Hawk Cliff, which is called Hawk Cliff because migrating hawks coming down south through Ontario get funneled because they don't want to hunt across logs. So the Great Lakes kind of funnels them into a natural corridor down towards base of Lake Erie at Point Pelee. And so going to Hawk Cliff was great. And I think that was where that it was like a thunderclap. There's somebody, they're banding them there. So there's ornithologists banding birds. So they catch them and then they bring them out to watch all us bird watchers and somebody standing in the back of a pickup truck with an orange juice can in his hand and open the orange juice can and there would be a kestrel or a sharp-shinned hawk. So on and so forth. Oh my God.
Wow.
And and they would just be looking right through us. There was just suddenly, it's like there was Hopkins windhover right there,
Yeah.
incarnated in a
And did
very
you know, what did you know when this happened, that something was happening to you that was going to shape your artistic life as well as as you described it, your moral life?
I wouldn't credit myself with that amount of insight. I was I
Okay.
went back to Hawkcliffe whenever I could. And
Mm.
I remember times I was teaching a class, and it was late September, just exactly when the hawks are migrating, and the weather was great, but there was a cold air coming down from the north. This is going to flush them down there. I got to get down to some mistake point. I remember I actually looked out the window and said, well, I think that's probably enough for us today. You know, you could read the for next week. Rushed out to my car and went down the hot cliff. And there was just, they call them it's called a kettle of broad-winged hawks. And there were like thousands of these broad-winged hawks in this kettle, like a little whirlwind of hawks going up in the air. When I passed, I drove down the lane behind it, and there was a guy looking down like this. And I stopped and said, you should be looking up at the hawks. He said, I know. He'd been there all day. And his eyes were kind of bleeding. He was taking a break, giving his eyes a break from staring at me. But it has that kind of effect. You're without being actually near a volcano or something like that, where you actually have huge earth processes. This whole migration thing was just like you're touching on some huge process of the earth, which leads to all kinds of other ones, you know. So the whole phenomenon of migration, Patrick, was just like that's the way we touch the actual processes of earth themselves, you know, because those migrations are often very, very finely tuned, you know. Like birds from the Arctic, hitting exactly the time when a sandworm comes up. They are just like semi-palmated plovers. They're migrating from the Arctic to South and South America, and they have to hit this beach at exactly that time for the sandworms to get enough weight on them to then fly to Venezuela in one go. So it's really amazing, you know. All that
you ask a question about birds, which I found fascinating. And initially I was startled by it because you were talking about looking at a bird and going beyond the aesthetic and asking the question of how does a bird make a living? And initially I thought that I found myself making the relationship between that question, make a living, and salary. But of course, I looked at it again and thought, of course, this bird makes a living because it's living. I was so interested in the economics of that as well as the observation and going beyond the aesthetics in that. Could you talk about what it is about all of those levels? You want to go deeper into the way a bird makes a living.
Yes. That's becoming more of like a student of it rather than just sort of like taking it in as a kind of a spectacle or phenomenon, you know. Why is it here right now? Why is the bird right here right now? And what's its nesting behavior? All those questions, which not by no means an ornithologist, but that's questions that leads you into. This is opposed to sort of there's a phenomenon among birders called listening, right? Where you just see it, then you check it off the list, and then you go on to the next thing. So this is like pausing, you know, go deeper into that check mark and ask about the habits of the bird, and you know why it's there. Why are all those semi-palmated plovers mustering on the beach in New Brunswick? Well, that's connected with the sandworms. And why are there merlins around here circling around? Because the merlins are circling around here because there's a whole lot of semi-palmated plovers that could be their supper. So it leads you into a whole bunch of related. In some ways, it's like instead of learning ecology as a kind of thing, it's like you get into it and you realize all those connections, or one or two of those connections, one by one. Yeah.
And when you write about a bird, I mean, clearly you're not just putting details, deeply researched details about bird life into poetic form. You're also engaging with it through metaphor and through questions about the human condition. The observer is present in your poems, even if you're trying to kind of just put the observer, the speaking voice, as just one voice amongst many living things. What is it that makes a nature poem a poem beyond just the recitation of data about what's being observed?
Yeah, I think that's partly where the poetry can be of a benefit to the scientific thing. It restores the personal, and it brings back, well, the sense of wonder, of course, you know. And that's from dry analytic accounts of any scientific phenomenon that can be kind of lost. Well, it can actually be kind of, especially in the old days, not so much now. I think with the burgeoning of the ecological sciences, there's way more crossing into that emotional and our human relation to that because of the nature of ecology itself. So having the observer there, being me as well, as the avenue for that whole avenue of that whole that whole right brain side of things. It's not just I saw the bird and it's this. Got a definite. It's a magnolia warbler. I got to check that one off my list. You're become more engaged, and also in the act of finding things out, I think we behave more like members of that ecosystem and less like just, well, controllers or masters of it. So we don't want to be repeating that whole error again.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
You're no stranger to writing about ecological crisis, but I've also heard you insist in the need to celebrate nature, not just mourn it. Could you talk a bit about that in terms of contemporary trends in writing and your own interest in celebrating nature?
God knows there's enough apocalyptic environmental news that uh, can just dismay us. I think for me personally, why I would do that is that just listening to that, which is the airways are full of it, and the press, just listening to that leads to a kind of depression in which we don't do anything. So if we don't celebrate, and we don't celebrate our presence there as well of it, then we're less likely to be it. Well, first of all, it's bad for our mental health. Despair's like, but secondly, I think it's probably in the long run bad for the possibilities of action. To be constantly. I do have a bunch of extinction poems in Lurch, and I was involved in a collaboration on extinction, and so I focus on that a lot. So, but I try not to let that be the whole burden of the piece. The whole burden of we don't want to ignore that, and the lamentable distinctions have already occurred now that we're in the sixth extinction. But if we let ourselves just get burdened by that, well, we'll just bog down in despair, I think. At least maybe put it this way, I'll just get bogged down in despair. I wouldn't assume that everybody else would, but yeah.
Yeah. What would you say is, over the course of this lifetime of writing, 50 years of publishing, what are some of the ways that you notice that you've changed in terms of what it is that you're doing in your writing from 1973, when you published Air Occupies Space, up until Lurch then in 2021?
Well, yeah, that's. I mean, do I have enough self-knowledge to even be able to answer that question? But I think certainly one of the main things that we just touched on was like the phenomenon birds, instead of just being involved with nature in a kind of superficial way, birds made me realize how important that was. And that, I guess I had a, so that was a major change. And then moving to BC and realizing that there was a lot of beautiful BC advertising and a kind of charade, because there was all kinds of clear cutting behind what they call the tourist strip. So there'd be 50 yards of big trees, and behind that clear cutting for miles. That kind of phenomenon, I want to get past that and engage in a different way with it, and well, outside this spectacular. So that was a major surge too. And then moving to Newfoundland, of course, the extension of the rock things into fossils. I've done some work with the fossil things. That was kind of another big surge as well.
Yeah.
I think for me, a lot of these things are partly not without. I'm not so conscious of the poetic processes that are happening with me, except when something in the phenomena out in the external world seems to call for some other resource of language, if you like.
Yeah. With this Lifetime Achievement Award, it might be that folks would turn to the most recent book, Lurch, or perhaps the collected poems. But are there earlier poems that you think are important as you think of your own career in writing?
Yes, I still have an affection for quite a lot of the earlier poems. Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. I was thinking back to a book I really enjoyed writing was uh, Another Gravity, which has kind of three foci. I was moved to sort of like I had simultaneously think something about home and homing, and gravity, and flight. So I opened three notebooks. I started writing three things. And when I was writing one, I thought all the metaphors and images came from the other two. So I was writing about gravity, home and flight were there. I write about flight, gravity. So I realized there was something going on with that, and I enjoy that quite a bit. Yeah,
Yeah. Mm.
yeah.
Mm.
I don't-
You are you're thanked at the one of the other winners of a Griffin Prize this year is Maggie Burton, who thanks you as well as Mary Dalton in the acknowledgements in the back of her book. I'm curious what you see your role as a Canadian poet. You're renowned internationally and amongst Canadian letters for your influence, your teaching, your support of other writing. Where do you see Canadian writing to be at these days? What themes do you see emerging?
Well, I hope I see a lot more nature poetry being written, etc. But
Mm,
there obviously are other huge. There's a huge impact from various forms of identity needed, but gender identity, but also identity from as in relation to the colonial versus indigenous context. All these things are present, and poetry in a lot of ways is a very good vehicle for those. I think.
mm,
I think for
yeah.
someone personally involved in transition, or personally involved in recovering indigenous identity, so on and so forth, poetry allows them a kind of more immediate response than say having to write a novel about it, so on and so forth. So
Yeah.
I think it's that. At the same time, I I hope that the environment is not getting edged out entirely by these other very important, very important preoccupations. So Maggie's part of a very informal reading group. I've actually was at a workshop, what was it, like maybe 10 years, 14 years ago, uh, at a place here in Newfoundland. And it turned out that many of the members of the group we're all in St. John's. We thought, well, why stop? And we just kept it going in a kind of informal way.
Mm,
Uh,
mm,
uh, and Maggie was a member of that group for a long time, so it's about getting your voice out there and getting some comment from sympathetic hearers, as
mm,
that can work. So I'm very happy that Maggie got some benefit from it. Yes.
yeah.
Everybody else.
Um, did I recall correctly that you were at a community garden when you heard news of having won this Lifetime Achievement Award?
Oh gosh, you got your ear to the ground, don't you? That's so cool. It's like, uh, yeah, uh, I was. I was in. It's a community garden that's attached to my house. I actually own the garden, but the property came out for sale, and in it here where the house, it's row housing, cheap by jowl housing, so, and we thought, well, what's going to happen to that? So I asked my neighbors, so if I got this place, would you be interested in having a garden plot in it? And we got lots of positive response, so that's what happened. So now it's pretty
Mm,
much a going concern. So when Karen
mm,
Soley wanted to talk to me, and said, "What's wow, I guess about 9 months ago or something." I said, "Well, let's go out and take a glass of wine out and go to the community garden." So that's where it
mm.
was.
Nice
It's
thing
like
to do. Nice thing to do.
very nice.
What's happening? What's happening in the community garden today? Have you been in it today?
Yeah, yes. Well, uh, the season's kind of delayed here. We had a very late spring, which is not uncommon for Newfoundland. So, uh, we're just getting people are coming in, bringing in, well, fixing up their plots and also bringing in uh, uh, fresh compost, keep them up. We have to have little
Mm,
plots here because the soil in St. John's, because it's an old city, the soil in St. John's is quite polluted. We have to bring
mm,
in soil. Each person has a plot. I'm a terrible gardener myself, but I love having a garden. So this is very, very, it's very, very self-interested in my part to have this. So I very much enjoy being out there. I do have a plot,
mm,
which I
yeah.
tend to grow
Mm.
garlic and rhubarb. The
Oh,
rhubarb is going great. The other plants are growing very slowly coming along now. But the
mm,
last few weeks has been quite good. Now we're
yeah.
actually seeing
Mm,
things coming up. Uh,
mm,
soil, some of the early
mm.
arugula and such like. Yeah, yeah. Thanks for
I
asking about
hear
that.
that you have some, yeah, well, I hear you have some gatherings in that garden too of dancers and artists and musicians and scientists all gathering
Ah,
there. What
I
happens in these gatherings?
well, you're now getting that garden confused with my partner's place. She has a place out of Portugal
Oh, I
called
see. Oh, my
outside town.
apologies.
So she has the poor, well, that's all right. I mean, it's a big influence on me, this Boreal Poetry Garden. Marlene Kreitz is the artist, and she has this 6 acres, and she was doing poetry walks around her garden, very, very site specific walks,
Mm.
and then branched out into inviting uh, other writers, musicians, and then beyond that, scientists. This back to what we were talking about before. In these, really, you walk from one place to another. We have a certain very, very general theme, like water or air or
Mm.
so on. And the sign, and we go from one site, a person would read a poem, another site, a person would be talking about, oh, common mammals that here are in Newfoundland and relating exactly to what was happening in this season. Or and then we'd have musicians. So we had and dancers. Oh my God. It's just like one of the, I mean, all this was fascinating, just as individual things. But I realized stepping back from it that I could just feel the silos collapsing. I taught in university for 30 years, and it was siloed, boy, from department, moving from the between the arts and between the arts and the scientists and the sciences, learning about we have an ornithologist, we had a mycologist about the whole fungal network, and another whole amazing area.
Mm.
And then afterwards, after that was all done, we go back to Marlene's in the garage and have a garage party. Then maybe the garage party helped with the conviviality. Never
I'm sure it
hurts.
did. Yeah.
So, but I just thought
Mm.
this was, I mean, we just kind of lucked into this, Marlene and I, but it was her idea to have the whole boreal party. So it takes up a lot of our time. It's quite a bit patch of woods, and we have the trail maintenance, and it's heavy, and just tending to the woods. We Marlene heats with wood, so we got that gives a lot of
Yeah.
reason to be out there just to cut down,
Mm.
cut trees that have fallen over and use them for wood in the winter.
Mm.
That's where we're at
Yeah.
right now. That's the
As I
we're in the
as
middle of
I
a project. Yeah.
uh, as I thought about that, it's bringing those people together. It seemed to me that it demonstrated something of a deep lifetime interest that you've had in integration, integrating the arts and sciences, integrating being part of the world, and just being one of the beings alive in the world, integrating, paying attention to time through geology and time through the passing lives of birds. What else are you trying to integrate these days?
That's a very lovely thing to say, by the way. All that would be wonderful. I think that would be. I'd love to have somebody say that. So, I'm so ingrained in it. Obviously, it's not always obvious to me what the overall shape of things might be. Integration. I think that's. I'm lucky to have grown up whilst ecology became established.
Mm.
And I think that's the kind of spirit of the ecological sciences, you know, very,
Mm.
they can't be siloed inside their sciences, it can't, a botanist can't ignore what's happening with the rocks around and all the other things. So that whole, and I've benefited from being in that part of that, you know, that just by the accidents of birth, that's historically, that's what's happened.
Yeah.
So
Mm.
yeah. Um, and I guess part along with this is another hobby horse of mine is like question dichotomies, which is the
Mm.
opposite of the integration thing. So like we
Mm.
love dichotomies. If we look at the political situation around the world now, you're seeing, alas, dichotomization is happening farther, more and more and more, either or,
Mm.
etc. And that's another, maybe that's an intellectual pursuit I should pursue farther. It's like the whys of this human impulse, or is it a human
Mm.
impulse? I'm not sure it's not just a Western civilization impulse. We
Yeah.
they.
Do you hope that asking questions, whether through poetry or through other forms of public language, can question those impulses that damage us and damage the environment and damage the ecology that causes so much crisis? Do you hope for a moral change through language, through your work as well?
I would almost, I mean, it seems like I want to articulate it at least for myself and maybe one or two
Mm,
readers. What I hope for there would actual change. Well, I think we have to live in hope at this
mm,
point, and something has to all change. From moving from mastery to membership. That is not just a simple, glib change, change of terminology. It's a whole it's a whole mindset.
mm,
And yeah, I'd like to be able to push away a little of that sort of sense of the what has become a kind of, it's buried in kind of philosophical like logic, right? To to establish you to establish come down to things as either A or B. It's not B, so therefore it must be A. And that kind of
yeah.
thinking, whilst very, very useful in an analytic setting, is not when it comes to the ecological sciences. Instead of
Mm,
thinking it's a reductive down to one or two things, it's always more and more and more. Or what have you factored in the
mm,
climatic issues? Have you factored in the pressure of the the foxes on the snowshoe hares, so on and so forth? So
mm,
it's always going to be more, and that is always, it doesn't condense itself well down to a PhD thesis or any kind of thesis. It's always going to be we're there with that impulse of wonder that's
mm.
holding in check our impulse of control, mastery, etc. Yeah.
Maybe that's where we need the negative capability of poetry and all that empty space.
Yeah, that was such an important, if Keats hadn't said that, somebody would have had to come along and invent it. But it's been there for so long
Mm,
time. We have to have the negative capability. Exactly. Exactly.
mm.
Yeah.
Um, as we come to an end, I wonder, is there a poem you'd like to read?
I I was just looking at uh, this is from Another Gravity, and I was thinking and I was thinking about the moon, and was part of one of the elements in here, as long with this home birds and so. And I contemplated about, there was planet Earth existed before there was a moon, before we had a moon, way way back. So
Mm,
we're talking billions of years back. And I thought, well, what would life have been like at that point? And so this
mm,
got me into sort of taking the moon outside the purely sort of romantic, uh,
mm.
moon in June and etc., lover's moon, etc., to the moon as an actual planetary object. I'm going to have to take a glass of water here. So this is speculating on what was life before the moon. Before the moon was a moon. Before it fitted itself into otherness inside the body of the earth, bulbed, broke out on its own. There was no second gravity and no dark art of reflection. The sun owned all the media, and it occurred to no one to resist its health and fitness propaganda. What everything was, that was it. No ifs or airspace. Place was obese before the moon was moon. So full of itself, there was no leaving home, and so no dwelling in it either. Longing was short and sedentary. Blues were red. No sweet tug toward our manic possibilities. No wistful, sidelong, inner sly. No alder branch hung above the smooth rush of the snow-fed river like the stray wisp hovering against your cheek, which in a moment you will tuck back into tidiness. No such stretched connection before moon was moon. No way to deflect the light away from photosynthesis and into alcohol and film. Each night was the same night and fell formlessly with no imagination and without you in it. My voice graduated more and more towards the Tom Waits style. Sorry. I'm hoping this is the late stages of laryngitis rather than the early ones, but it's been a little
Oh, hopefully,
late.
yeah.
But I think it became more
Uh,
interesting as I went on.
mm. Um, there's such a praising of night and water, and all the life that comes from water in that, and that you at the end of the poem is so moving.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I just thought that it's the moon as opposed to the sun's uh, uh, visual acuity
Mm.
leaves us with that way. The moon is the entry point for imagination,
Mm.
and for us to enter into it rather than just be that's that. You know, it is
Yeah.
the entry point for poetry for sure. Yeah.
Mm. Well, Don McKay, I want to congratulate you for winning the 2024 Lifetime Achievement Award from the Griffin Poetry Prizes, and also for being the current only member of the shortlist of the best 3-point shot of any poet born before 1943.
Probably a lot of people, maybe all kinds of people will be challenging me for this now. That'd be
I
kind of
know, that's what I'm hoping. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you
Yeah,
so much. It's been a very great pleasure talking to you. Thanks for
pleasure
doing
to
the
talk
work
to you.
of reading up on my stuff for this. That's really nice.
The pleasure.